The room did not know what to do with her. That was the first thing Cecily Hartwell noticed when Mr. Prentice, the solicitor's clerk, announced her name in the doorway of Alderton House's great drawing room on a Tuesday morning in late November. The room did not know what to do with her. The four gentlemen seated at the mahogany table looked up from their papers with the polished vacancy of men confronted by something their categories had not prepared them for. She was not a wife, not a widow, not a mother come to plead a son's debts. She stood in a borrowed wool mantle, her gloves worn to near transparency at the thumb, her chin at a level that cost her nothing visible and everything interior. The fire behind the table threw a long warmth across the papers, and the papers carried her brother's name in ink she had not been permitted to read. At the head of the table sat the Duke of Alderton. She had not expected him to be present. His Grace Elliot Beaumont, 4th Duke of Alderton, was said to have purchased 3 ruined estates in the last 5 years, and to have never purchased anything carelessly. He was watching her with eyes the color of pewter, his face very still, his hands flat on the table as though he had set them there deliberately to keep them from moving. He did not look like a man who had just bought a woman's home. He looked like a man who was reading something written in a language he had believed extinct. "Miss Hartwell," said Prentice, from somewhere behind her left shoulder, "perhaps you would be seated." She remained standing. She had walked 4 miles in the cold to be here. She would not be seated until she chose to be. The Duke's expression did not change. One of the other gentlemen shifted in his chair. The fire cracked once, sending a spark against the grate, and the sound was the loudest thing in the room. Cecily had been called many things since her brother Viscount Hartwell had sold Hartwell Park 3 weeks prior to settle his gaming debts. The season's charity case was the phrase Lady Rosalind Carre had used at the Montfort card party, pitched in that carrying tone designed to wound while remaining technically audible only to those within 6 feet. The season's charity case, as though 9 years of managing the estate's accounts, the tenants' welfare, and her brother Phineas's increasingly ruinous decisions had produced in her nothing but an object of pity. She was 28 years old. She had £41 remaining to her name, a trunk of her mother's letters, and a folded document in the inner pocket of her mantle that she had spent 4 nights composing at a kitchen table in the Montfort housekeeper's cottage by a candle she had begged from the kitchen maid. She set the document on the mahogany table. "I have a counter-proposal," she said. "You have not met a woman like Cecily before, though you may have hoped to. Stay a little longer, and you will see what quiet steadiness can purchase when the world has finished setting its price." Hartwell Park had been her mother's before it was her brother's, and her mother's mother's before that. The entail that gave it to male heirs had been Cecily's particular inheritance of grief for as long as she could remember. As a child, she had walked the park's 412 acres with her mother in the early mornings, learning the names of each field as other children might learn their letters, the home meadow and the long wood and the old orchard at the eastern boundary wall, where the pear trees still bore fruit in years when no one pruned them. Her mother had said, once, that a woman who knew her land the way Cecily knew Hartwell Park could not truly be dispossessed of it, regardless of what the law permitted. Her mother had believed this. Cecily was not certain she had her mother's faith, only her mother's stubbornness. Phineas Hartwell had been a pleasant young man before he had been a viscount, and a viscount before he had been a ruin. The title had reached him at 23 with the full force of a gift that carried no instruction manual for responsible use. He had run through their father's modest reserve inside 18 months. He had then run through the tenants' rents. He had then run through the slate of credit that 3 generations of careful Hartwells had accumulated with the county's merchants. And after that, he had gone to London and found the gaming tables at which a man of moderate luck and no discipline could accomplish what poverty alone could not. He had sold his sister's future in a Thursday night session at a club Cecily had never seen to a man she had met once at a hunt ball in exchange for the cancellation of a debt of £11,400. The Duke of Alderton had not known she existed. This was the fact that had kept Cecily moving through the 4 miles of cold, through the iron morning frost on the lane from the Montfort cottage to the village, and then the longer road south toward Alderton House, which sat at the far end of its own long drive, like a man who had never needed to impress anyone. She did not resent his grace for what Phineas had done. She could not hold a man accountable for a transaction he had entered without knowledge of its full contents. What she required was that he understand those contents now. He had read her document in full. She knew this, because the silence that followed her setting it on the table was not the silence of a man scanning for the relevant clause. It was the silence of a man who had reached the end of a text and was reconsidering what he believed it meant. The other three gentlemen had exchanged glances. Prentice had made a small sound near the door. Alderton had not moved. "You propose?" he said at last, and his voice was low and level, with the particular restraint of a man who chose each word the way a careful navigator chose each. "Step on unfamiliar ground, to purchase the state from me. I propose to make you a fair offer for it, Your Grace, conditional on a schedule of payment across 5 years. You have £41. The blood rose in her face. She did not permit it to reach her expression. "I have the management of a 412-acre estate across 9 years, including 3 consecutive harvests during a period of poor weather, 2 years of tenant disputes resolved without litigation, and a working familiarity with every account, lease, and repair schedule the property carries. I am, in effect, the only person in this room who knows what Hartwell Park actually requires to remain solvent." She paused. The £41 is a circumstantial detail. One of the gentlemen made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Alderton looked at her for a long, measured moment. "You had better sit down, Miss Hartwell," he said. "This will take some time." She sat. The arrangement they reached that morning was not the one she had proposed. She had proposed a purchase. What Alderton offered instead was a position. She was to serve as the estate's managing agent for a period of 12 months at a salary of £60 per quarter, with a formal option to purchase at the end of that year, at a price they fixed together in the room, with Prentice scratching the figures into a fresh document as they negotiated across the table, the fire burning lower and the November afternoon pressing against the windows. He did not offer her charity. He drove a precise and attentive negotiation, corrected 2 of her figures when she understated the projected timber yield, and accepted without visible surprise when she corrected one of his estimates regarding the cost of the eastern boundary wall. At the end of 2 hours, they had an agreement that was not what she had come for, and was more than she had any right to expect. She did not know, when she walked back along the long drive in the failing winter light with the document folded in her pocket alongside her mother's letters, that he had watched her from an upstairs window until she reached the gate. She did not know that when Prentice had said, afterward, "An unusual woman, Your Grace," Alderton had replied, after a pause of several seconds, "Yes." She did not know any of this, and the not knowing produced in her nothing but the clean, practical clarity of someone who has secured the first foothold on a wall she fully intends to climb. Hartwell Park received her back as though it had been waiting. She had not set foot in it since the morning of Phineas's sale, when she had carried her trunk out herself because the footman had been dismissed, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Dorrit, was too old for carrying, and she had not looked back at the grey stone frontage, because looking back had seemed like a luxury she could not afford. Now she stood in the entrance hall with a candle and her mantle, and the December cold still on her skin, and the house was quiet around her in the way that old houses are quiet when they know who belongs in them. Mrs. Dorrit appeared at the top of the stair with a lamp. She looked at Cecily for a long moment, her face working through several distinct expressions. "Miss Cecily," she said finally. "Good evening, Mrs. Dorrit. I am sorry for the hour. I will explain everything in the morning." "You will explain it now," said Mrs. Dorrit, already descending. "And then I will make you something to eat, because you look as though you have walked here." "I have," said Cecily, "from Alderton House." Mrs. Dorrit absorbed this. "Well," she said, "I suppose there are worse things than being bought by a duke." The first 6 weeks passed in the particular currency of competence. Cecily worked from the estate's office, which she had always preferred to call the accounts room, because calling it an office gave it an official character that made Phineas nervous in the days when making Phineas nervous had still been a useful tool. She reviewed every lease, corrected the rent roll figures that Phineas's man of business had recorded incorrectly for 3 consecutive years, commissioned the repair on the northern tenant cottage, whose roof had been a running concern since the previous spring, and wrote a clear and detailed report on the state of the home meadow drainage, which she sent to Alderton House by the Tuesday post and received back 4 days later with 3 marginal notes in a steady, rather compressed hand that neither praised nor dismissed her findings, only asked 3 specific questions about cost and timeline. She answered the questions. The correspondence developed its own rhythm. Tuesday posts sent, Saturday posts received. She found herself reading his notes with the close attention she usually reserved for accounts, not because they were warm, they were not, but because they were precise in a way that suggested. He read her reports with the same close attention she brought to the writing of them. No word was surplus, no question was rhetorical. There was a quality of regard in the exchanges that she could not name, without endangering the clarity she needed to keep. He came to the estate for the first time in the second week of January, on a morning when she was in the orchard directing the repair of the eastern boundary wall, her mantle tucked into her belt and her gloves already ruined by the morning's work. She heard hooves on the lane before she saw him, and then he was there on a gray horse, watching her direct the mason from 20 yards away, and she felt the precise movement he registered what he was looking at, not by his expression, which did not change, but by the slight adjustment in the angle of his head, the way a careful reader moves fractionally closer to a text he has not expected to find. Interesting. Your Grace, she said, not moving from her position beside the wall. Miss Hartwell. He dismounted without taking his eyes from the wall. He walked along it for several yards, running one hand along the old stone, testing the mortar at a gap she had not yet reached. You have begun with the north section. The breach in the north section was permitting the Prentice tenants' cattle access to the long wood. It seemed the more pressing concern. She paused. Your Grace might have given me notice of a visit. I might have, he agreed. He said nothing further on the subject. She turned back to the mason and gave the next instruction, specifying the depth of mortar at the corner joint where the frost had gone deepest, and then moving to the stack of dressed stone to check the dimensions against the gap, running her hand along the cut face, the way her mother had taught her to feel for the quality of the work before accepting it. She was aware of him standing at the edge of the orchard with his horse's reins in one hand for the next quarter hour, not watching her in the way that men who wanted to unsettle women watch them, but with the quality of attention a man brings to something he is trying to understand. The mason asked her a question about the northeast corner, and she answered it without hesitation. Because she had been watching that particular stretch of wall deteriorate for 3 years and knew it as well as she knew any face she had reason to remember. When she finished and turned back toward the house, Alderton fell into step beside her without asking permission, and without asserting it, which was its own sort of statement. The report you sent regarding the drainage, he said, after they had covered 20 yards in silence. Yes? You calculated the projected improvement to yield over 3 years. You did not calculate the cost of doing nothing. She looked at him sideways. I assumed the cost of doing nothing was self-evident. It is. I wanted to know whether you thought so. She did not know what to do with this. She kept her face composed and her stride even, and she did not permit herself to examine why his opinion of her reasoning should feel different from any other man's opinion of her reasoning, which it should not, and did not, she was nearly certain. He walked with her as far as the kitchen garden wall, where she had left her outer gloves on the stone, and he waited without apparent impatience while she put them on. And she was aware of his attention in the particular way one is aware of a fire behind one's back, not as heat precisely, but as an alteration in the quality of the surrounding air. Mrs. Dorrit, who had been watching from the kitchen window, told the kitchen maid that afternoon that she did not know what was to happen with those two, but she suspected it would be something. The kitchen maid agreed. Neither of them said this aloud in Cecily's presence, because they were not young women and they knew the shape of things. It was Lady Rosalind Carre who introduced the complication, as Lady Rosalind generally introduced things, with confident gaiety and the blunt edge of old money's certainty. She arrived at the Montfort card party in early February, with the specific gravity of a woman who had decided something, and she made her decision known in the practiced manner of the aristocracy, not by announcement, but by repetition of a thing in the presence of those she wished to inform. The Duke, she told 3 separate groups across the course of the evening, was expected to take a decision about his situation this season. His situation was a polite word for his widowhood of 3 years, his estate's need for a mistress, and the fact that a man of his consequence could not be managed by a hired agent indefinitely, regardless of the agent's practical efficiency. The season's charity case had done adequately with the wall, and the drainage, no doubt. One made use of what one had, but management was not legacy. Cecily heard the 3rd iteration of this at close range, from behind a column near the card-room door, because she had been sent to this party by Mrs. Dorrit, who believed that isolation was a more dangerous enemy than condescension. She had been standing there for perhaps 2 minutes, holding a glass she was not drinking from, watching the candles in the chandelier make their small adjustments in the draught from the far door. Lady Rosalind's voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about how things were done, and had the social architecture of 4 decades to prove it. The season's charity case. 3 distinct phrases, 3 distinct audiences, the same 4 syllables dropped with the careful precision of a woman who knew the weight of a word and used it deliberately. The 3rd time it landed differently than the first 2, not with the sting of novelty, but with the heaviness of a verdict that was settling into the general agreement of the room. Cecily came out from behind the column. She moved to the card table nearest Lady Rosalind, accepted the vacant seat, arranged her cards, and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. Her presence in the seat was its own form of speech. Alderton arrived late to the party. He crossed the room toward the card table within 4 minutes of entering, which Cecily did not observe because she was attending to her cards, but which the 3 other women at the table observed with varying degrees of interest and calculation. He stood at the edge of the table in conversation with Lord Montfort for a time, and then Lord Montfort moved away, and Alderton was still at the edge of the table, and Lady Rosalind laughed at something across the room, and Cecily laid her final card. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a question. She looked up at him. His face was composed, the gray eyes level, the expression that gave away nothing except, if one looked carefully, the slight tension at the hinge of his jaw that she had learned, across 6 weeks of Tuesday correspondence, meant he had made a decision and was waiting to see whether she would understand it. She set her cards face down on the table. She rose. She walked with him to the far end of the room, where a pair of tall windows overlooked the Montfort garden and the February night pressed against the glass. "Lady Rosalind," she said, to the window. "Lady Rosalind," he agreed, to the same window. A pause. The fire at the far end of the room sent warmth in diminishing waves toward them. "She is not incorrect," he said, "that there are practical questions about the estate's management which the current arrangement does not permanently resolve." "No," Cecily said. "She is not incorrect." She did not know what she expected him to say next. She had learned to hold her expectations of this man very carefully, because he had a habit of not doing what she anticipated, which was simultaneously her primary frustration with him, and the characteristic she respected most. He turned from the window. "I had a wife," he said, 3 years ago." He looked at his own hands for a moment, as though checking that they were still there. "She was a woman of good sense and considerable warmth, and she died of a fever in June of 1814, in a fortnight, before the physician could establish what to do. She had a way of knowing what I meant before I said it. I had believed after her that this was a particular quality of hers, and that it was therefore gone." He stopped. The fire across the room cracked once. I was apparently mistaken. She held very still. "I am not," he continued in the same level tone, "offering you a romantic declaration. Miss Hartwell, I am observing that the situation as it stands is one that requires a decision, and that my inclination, when I examine it with any honesty, has been settled on the only decision that appears to me to be accurate for considerably longer than is perhaps proper to admit." The room at a distance continued its evening. Cecily was aware of her own breath, of the cold coming off the window glass and the warmth reaching from the room, and of the worn cuff of her glove where the stitching had pulled at the thumb, which she pressed flat against her thigh. "I have 41 pounds, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, a motion so constrained it was barely there. "You have considerably more than 41 pounds, he said. "You have a document, executed in Prentice's presence, establishing your right to purchase Hartwell Park in 11 months' time. What you have not," he added, "is a permanent resolution to the practical problem of the season's verdict, which will not improve simply because you ignore it." She looked at him for a long moment, taking the careful inventory she had learned to take of his face, which was the color of old stone in winter light, the jaw set, the eyes giving away nothing except what they always gave away when he was entirely serious, which was a stillness that was not coldness but its opposite. "You are proposing," she said carefully. "I am. In front of a window in Lord Montfort's drawing room at a card party. Yes, without flowers or any of the usual formalities." "The formalities," he said, have always struck me as methods by which people avoid saying what they mean." She was quiet for a beat. The fire cracked again. Outside, the February garden was dark, and the first suggestion of snow was whitening the gravel path. "I will want the purchase agreement to stand regardless," she said. "Hartwell Park's to be mine outright. Not as a gift, not as an attachment to a marriage settlement. Mine." He looked at her with an attention that was nothing like the way the solicitor's clerks looked at her, or the way Lady Rosalind's eyes moved over her at card parties. "Yes," he said. "I had assumed you would require that. Prentice will need approximately 3 days to draft the amendment." She had not known, when she walked 4 miles in November, that this was where the road went. She had not known that a man who bought a ruined estate could look at the woman who had built it into itself for 9 years and see what was actually there, rather than the category she occupied in everyone else's accounting. She stood at the window of Lord Montfort's drawing room and let the understanding settle in her the way cold air settles, filling the space completely, without drama. She had not seen it yet. "You have. Now watch what she does with it." "Then I accept," she said. "Your Grace." There were 4 things Cecily had not anticipated about the weeks that followed, and she would think of them later, in the warm arithmetic of what had been recorded arrive at the life she was living. The first was that Phineas, when informed of the engagement, wept. Not from guilt, though guilt was present in the room alongside him, sitting in the chair nearest the door like a man who has arrived uninvited and knows it. He wept from a relief she had not expected him to feel, and from the particular shame of a man who understands precisely what he has done, and has no vocabulary adequate to the understanding. She sat with him for an hour in the Montfort housekeeper's sitting room, in 2 chairs drawn toward the cold grate, and she said almost nothing, because there was almost nothing to say that would not be either too much or too little. At one point he said, "I did not think you would manage it." She said, "I know." He said, "I did not think anyone would." She said, "I know that too." The cold grate held the morning's ash, and the window gave onto the stable yard. And somewhere in the yard, a horse stamped once against the cobblestones. When the hour was done, she rose and touched his shoulder once, briefly, and went out. Because she had learned a long time ago that some repairs required the damaged party to sit alone with the evidence of what they had done, and that the sister's role in such moments was to leave the door unlocked. The second was that Mrs. Dorrit received the news with a composure so absolute it suggested she had been expecting it since approximately the 2nd Tuesday post. The third was Lady Rosalind. She arrived at Alderton House 3 days after the engagement was generally known, on the pretext of a call she had not made in 2 years, and she sat in the yellow sitting room across from Cecily with the expression of a woman whose script has, for the first time in her life, required a revision she was not prepared to make. She had dressed carefully for this call, which Cecily noted, and she had brought her daughter Georgiana, which Cecily also noted, and she had prepared, apparently, a speech about the value of proper established connections for a man of the Duke's standing, which was interrupted before it could properly begin by the arrival of Alderton himself, who came into the yellow sitting room from the library corridor with a book under his arm and a quality of expression that made Lady Rosalind's prepared speech fold its pages quietly and decline to proceed. "Lady Rosalind," he said pleasantly. "Miss Kerr." He did not elaborate on this greeting. He set his book on the side table, sat in the chair nearest Cecily, and looked across the room with the polite and total blankness of a man who sees nothing in this room that he intends to address, except by his presence in it. The visit lasted precisely the time it took for Lady Rosalind to understand that nothing in this room was going to move. She left without saying the season's charity case a 4th time. The absence of the phrase was the loudest thing in the room after the door closed. Cecily sat for a moment in the yellow chair, looking at the fire, feeling the specific warmth of having been seen in the right direction by someone who did not require instruction about where to look. "You did not have to come in from the library," she said. "I had finished the chapter," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The fire sent a bar of light across the turkey rug between them. "Prentice has finished the amendment," he said. "Whenever you are ready to sign." She had believed for so long that the only transaction available to her was survival. She had run accounts and managed harvests and protected what she loved through the mechanism of competence, because competence was the only currency she had been given permission to spend. She had not known that a man existed who looked at the evidence of 9 years' worth of that competence and saw not a useful instrument but a person, worthy of the same specificity she brought to everything she touched. She picked up the book he had left on the side table. It was a treatise on drainage systems, extensively annotated in the same compressed hand she had been reading in the margins of her Tuesday reports. "You have been reading about the home meadow drainage," she said. "I have been trying to understand your calculations," he said. "The third section. You were wrong about the coefficient." "I know," he said. "I reached that conclusion on page 47. I wanted to see whether you had noted it." She opened the book to page 47. His marginal note said simply, "Hartwell was correct." This was the fourth thing she had not anticipated. Not the declaration in Lord Montfort's drawing room, not the purchase agreement and its amendment, not the morning in the orchard when he had stood at the edge of the long wood and looked at her as though she were a text he had not expected to find worthwhile, not any of the pieces individually, but the accumulated weight of all of them together, which was the weight of being known. The morning of the public accounting arrived without theater. They had agreed, at Prentice's suggestion, that the formal signing of both documents should take place at Hartwell Park itself, in the accounts room where Cecily had spent 9 years of mornings, because Prentice had a methodical quality that appreciated symmetry, and because Alderton, when the suggestion was made, had looked at Cecily and said nothing, and she had looked back and said, "Yes, I think that is right." And that had been the end of the discussion. They came on a Thursday morning in late March, which arrived with the particular generosity of English spring, the light very clear, and the air mild for the first time since October, the long wood at the edge of the park just beginning to show the pale green of early leaf. Prentice came, and his senior clerk, and Phineas, who had asked to attend with the specific gravity of a man who understands that witnessing is its own form of repair. Lady Rosalind had not been invited, which was not precisely an exclusion and was not precisely accidental either, Mrs. Dorrit had prepared the accounts room and placed the chair Cecily always used at the center of the table, which she would later deny having done deliberately. They gathered around the table where, 4 months before, Cecily had set her counter-proposal on the mahogany surface and stood in her worn gloves and her borrowed mantle, and Prentice laid out the documents in his particular order, waited at the corners with the small brass discs he always carried, and the spring light came through the windows. At the angle it had always come through those windows, touching the surface of the old desk in the corner where her mother had sometimes worked in the afternoons. The accounts room smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the faint mineral edge of the ink Prentice kept in a leather case. And Cecily had spent more mornings in this room than she could accurately count, and she stood in it now as its owner for the first time in her life, and found that the room felt precisely as it always had, which was the truest measure she knew of what she had been building toward. Alderton stood at the far end of the table and watched her cross the room to the chair. Something in the set of his face was different from the composure she had been reading for 4 months. It was composed in the same way, but the thing held behind it was no longer held quite so far back, the way a river that has been running under ice comes closer to the surface as the season turns. Prentice read the first document. It established Cecily Hartwell as sole owner of Hartwell Park and its 412 acres, in fee simple, by right of purchase in the full and agreed amount, payable to the Duke of Alderton across a term of 5 years at the schedule they had negotiated, with no condition attached to her marital status or personal circumstance, or the continuation of any other agreement between the parties. She was the owner of Hartwell Park because she had negotiated its purchase and would pay its price from her own earnings, and on no other basis. The clerk's pen moved. Prentice's page turned. The second document was the marriage settlement. It was, in Alderton's phrase, notable primarily for what it declined to contain. Phineas had gone very quiet at the side of the room. His face showed the particular expression of a man watching a correction to a ledger he cannot himself make. When both documents were signed and witnessed and the clerk's ink was dry, Prentice gathered the papers with his usual precise efficiency, and the clerk folded his materials, and the room shifted from the register of a legal proceeding back into the register of a Thursday morning in March, clear light and the faint smell of the orchard's early blossom coming through the cracked window. Phineas said Cecily and stopped, because there was nothing to follow it that would be sufficient, and he seemed to know it. She looked at him. "Come and see the eastern wall when you are ready," she said. "We have repaired the breach." He nodded. He was not crying. which required a visible effort she respected. Alderton had not moved from the far end of the table. He stood watching her with the gray eyes that had looked at her 4 months ago, as though she were something requiring careful deciphering. She did not think he was still deciphering. "The third section of the drainage report," she said. "I have the revised figures." "Bring them," he said. "Tonight, if you like." The room was very still. Prentice had the discretion to find something requiring his attention near the door. "I should warn you," she said, "that the figure for the mill race repair is higher than I initially projected." "I assumed it would be," he said. "Your initial projection was deliberately conservative." She looked at him steadily. "How did you know it was deliberate?" "Because every other figure you gave me was exact," he said. "That one had a margin that made no sense unless it was intentional." She had not known, when she folded her counter-proposal into the pocket of her mother's mantle and walked out into the November cold, what it would feel like to be read accurately by someone who had no obligation to read her at all, and had done it anyway. From the first morning, because he was constituted in a way that could not look at evidence and pretend to see something else. She had thought for 28 years that the only reliable transaction was between herself and a problem, that people were variables in the account rather than the account's purpose. She understood now that she had been keeping the wrong books. "Elliot," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She did not follow it with anything else, because the name itself carried the full weight of what she intended, which was acknowledgement and precision, and the particular warmth of having been found by someone who was looking. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He took her hand, with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he does not intend to revisit, and held it, and looked at her, and the long winter that had begun in November with a document on a table resolved itself in the quiet, exactly specific warmth of a March morning and the long wood beginning to turn green outside the window. "This property," he said, "has an excellent prospect from the upper garden." "It does," she said. "I should like to see it this afternoon, if you will show me." "I will show you all 412 acres," she said, "if you have the time." The corner of his mouth moved. "I have the time," he said. By the following spring, Hartwell Park had a new name on its gate for the purposes of the household's organization, though the stone lintel above the door still read simply Hartwell in the characters that her great-grandmother had commissioned, and Cecily did not correct it, because the stone was older than any title and was saying what it had always said. The home meadow drainage was complete, the yield that first season exceeding her own projections by 7%, which she reported to Alderton in the form of a Tuesday note, and which he returned the following Saturday with a single marginal annotation reading that he had told her the coefficient was wrong. She kept the note in the old desk in the accounts room, in the drawer where her mother had once kept her household correspondence, tucked beneath the treatise on drainage systems, which he had given her in November with his annotations still inside. On a Tuesday evening in April, when the orchard was in full flower, and the blossom came through the window of the accounts room, in the last of the afternoon light, she found him there before her, standing at her desk, reading the drainage report for the following year, with the concentrated attention of a man who read everything as though it might be important. He did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him, this man who had looked at the evidence of everything she was and seen it clearly, without instruction, in the first hour she had stood in front of him. He turned. He saw her. She set the new figures on the desk beside the old ones, and the room held them both in the warm, particular light of an April evening, and outside, the pear trees in the orchard were in bloom. She had come home, and the home was hers, and he was in it. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's story moved you, you are in good company.